"Ma'am, step away from that desk. Right now." The officer's voice cut through the silence of the courtroom like a whip, sharp and commanding. His heavy boots stomped against the polished marble floor as he closed in on the woman sitting behind the judge's desk, his presence large, intimidating, full of unchecked authority. His hand hovered dangerously close to his holster, fingers twitching slightly as he prepared himself for what he assumed would be a confrontation. The woman, however, remained completely still. She didn't flinch at his aggressive tone, didn't even acknowledge the weight of his approaching footsteps. She continued flipping through the legal documents in front of her, her movements calm, deliberate, as if she hadn't just been given an order by a man who believed he had complete control of the space around him. The officer's brow furrowed in frustration at her lack of response. His jaw tightened, his breath came out in an irritated huff. He wasn't used to being ignored, especially not by someone like her. "Did you not hear me?" His voice came out even harsher this time, his patience already running thin. "I said get up. This is a restricted area, and you have no business sitting in that chair. I need you to move immediately." She finally exhaled, slowly, as if contemplating whether or not this moment deserved her attention. Without rushing, she lifted her eyes from the paperwork and met his stare with a gaze so steady, so unwavering, it made his skin prickle. There was something unsettling about how completely unbothered she appeared. "And you are?" Her voice was smooth, controlled, like she had all the time in the world. The officer let out a sharp, incredulous laugh, his lips twisting into something cruel. "I'm the one who's about to throw you out of here if you don't move," he said, stepping closer, his imposing figure looming over her. "Throw me out," she repeated, tilting her head slightly as if she had misheard him. There was no fear in her voice. No anxiety. Just a quiet amusement, but the look in her eyes told a different story, there was no humor there. The officer's annoyance flared into something hotter, something nastier. He was done playing games. "Don't act dumb with me," he snapped, his temper rising with every passing second. "You don't belong here. I don't know how you got in, but I know damn well you aren't supposed to be sitting in that chair, messing with court documents like you have authority here. Now I'm telling you one last time, get up, or I will remove you myself." She didn't move. Didn't blink. Didn't even acknowledge the threat in his words. That was all the justification the officer needed. His patience had officially run out. With one swift, forceful motion, he lunged forward and grabbed her arm, yanking her up from the chair with unnecessary force. She stumbled slightly from the suddenness of it, but still, she didn't resist. She didn't struggle. Her body stayed loose, unthreatening. He started dragging her toward the door, his grip tightening around her arm as if she were a criminal caught in the act. "You people," he muttered under his breath, the disgust in his voice unmistakable, "think you can just walk in anywhere you want, take what you want, do whatever you want." The courtroom doors slammed open. The sound echoed through the vast chamber like a gunshot, the tension in the air snapping to attention. A woman stood in the doorway, her eyes wide, her expression frozen in shock. "What the hell is going on in here?" The court clerk's voice rang through the chamber, filled with alarm. Her gaze darted frantically between the officer, whose grip was still firm on the woman's arm, and the woman herself, who remained eerily composed despite being forcibly manhandled. The officer barely spared the clerk a glance, too locked in his own sense of righteous authority to even consider that he might be in the wrong. Instead, he jerked his chin toward the judge's bench, his grip still firm as he gestured at the chair she had been sitting in. "I caught her behind the judge's desk," he said with absolute certainty, like he had just uncovered some great crime. "Snooping through files, God knows why. She's probably trying to steal something or," the woman let out a slow, measured breath, as if this entire scene was beneath her, as if she had no desire to waste energy on it. Then, without urgency, she reached into the inner pocket of her blazer. The officer stiffened immediately. His grip on her arm turned painful, fingers digging into her skin. His entire body tensed, the instinct drilled into him over years of service telling him to be ready to act, to be ready for a threat. "Don't even think about it," he warned sharply, his voice low, dangerous. But what she pulled out wasn't a weapon. It was something far more powerful. A badge. A judge's badge. It gleamed under the fluorescent lights, a small but undeniable symbol of authority. Of her authority. The same badge that carried the name engraved outside the courtroom, displayed in golden letters. The same name that belonged to the presiding judge of this court. Her name. The officer's breath hitched. His entire body went rigid. His fingers uncurled instantly, as if her skin had burned him the second he realized what he had done. The silence in the room was thick, suffocating, pressing down on his chest with unbearable weight. She moved with practiced ease, like she had done this 1,000 times before. With complete composure, she dusted off the sleeve of her blazer, smoothed out an imaginary wrinkle, and straightened her posture with an air of authority so unshakable it made the walls of the courtroom feel smaller. Then, finally, she looked at him again. This time, her eyes weren't just calm. They were something else entirely. Something final. "You just put your hands on a sitting judge," she said. Her voice wasn't loud. It wasn't angry. It was fact. Unforgiving. Absolute. The officer felt his stomach drop into an endless abyss. His hands trembled slightly, barely perceptible, but she saw. She saw everything. His breathing was shallow now, coming out in uneven bursts. His heart was pounding so hard it drowned out the silence in his ears. The weight of what he had just done crashed down on him. And for the first time in his career, for the first time in his life, the officer realized something terrifying. He had no power here. The power belonged to her. And what happened next left everyone in shock. "Hey, family. Here at Plow of Twist, we stand firmly against racism, discrimination, and injustice in all its forms. This channel is a place where we tell powerful stories that expose the truth, celebrate resilience, and demand justice. To all our Black viewers out there, you are seen. You are valued. You are powerful. This story is for you. Now, sit back and enjoy, because what you're about to hear will leave you speechless. Don't forget to subscribe and join us for more eye-opening stories. Now, let's get into it. The Montgomery County Courthouse stood like an unshaken monument to tradition, its grand marble pillars reaching skyward, casting long, commanding shadows over the bustling streets below. The building was old, soaked in history, some righteous, much of it unjust. Generations had walked through its halls seeking justice, some finding it, others leaving in handcuffs, their fates sealed before they even spoke a word. The floors, waxed to perfection, reflected the bright fluorescent lighting above, illuminating the many faces that passed through its doors every day, lawyers with their briefcases full of arguments, clerks carrying stacks of paperwork heavier than their own will to keep going, defendants with hope or fear in their eyes, and officers, ever present, standing like sentinels to uphold the very law that so often bent in favor of some while crushing others. It was here, in one of the many courtrooms, that Judge Aaliyah Carter held court. And it was here, in the very place where her authority should have been unquestionable, that Officer Greg Millstone made the biggest mistake of his life. Aaliyah Carter was not just any judge. She was the embodiment of resilience, the living proof that barriers meant to keep people like her out could be shattered through sheer will and brilliance. Her presence in that courthouse was not just a career milestone, it was a statement. A Black woman, sitting in judgment, in a place where people like her were once denied even the right to sit in the gallery. She carried the weight of her ancestors with every decision, every gavel strike, every sentence handed down. Yet, despite all she had overcome, despite the years of studying, of proving herself over and over again in a world that demanded twice as much from her just to be considered half as good, despite earning the very chair she sat in, none of it mattered in that moment. Not to him. Not to Officer Greg Millstone. Greg had been a police officer for nearly 20 years. His uniform fit him like a second skin, his badge worn with the quiet pride of a man who believed himself to be the gatekeeper of order, a man who had spent his life upholding what he saw as the natural structure of power. In his mind, there was a clear division between those who made the rules, those who enforced them, and those who simply had to obey. That structure had never been questioned in his world, it was law, just as unshaken and immovable as the courthouse itself. His father had been a police officer, his grandfather before him. Authority was in his blood. And he wore it like armor. Greg had built a career on control. He was the officer who commanded respect, who walked into a room and made sure everyone knew who was in charge. He had made countless arrests, broken up hundreds of fights, stood at the front lines of protests that he didn't bother to understand, his mind already made up about the people standing on the other side. He believed in discipline. He believed in law and order. And most of all, he believed that some people simply didn't belong in certain places. So when he walked into that courtroom, when his eyes landed on the black woman sitting behind the judge's desk without a robe, without the familiar trappings of authority that he was accustomed to recognizing, his instincts made the decision for him. She wasn't supposed to be there. She couldn't be. To him, there was no question. No hesitation. No moment of doubt. The truth didn't even have time to present itself before he had already acted. His feet moved before logic had a chance to catch up. His hand reached for her before his brain even processed the full situation. Greg had seen fraud before, had caught enough people sneaking into places they didn't belong, pretending to be more than they were. And in his mind, that's exactly what was happening now. She was pretending. Sitting in a seat that wasn't meant for her. Going through papers she had no right to touch. There was no pause, no second guessing. Greg grabbed her. The moment his fingers wrapped around her arm, the moment he felt her skin under his grip, something deep inside Aaliyah shifted. She didn't struggle. She didn't fight back. She didn't scream, though God knew she had every right to. No, she did something far more powerful. She stayed silent. Not because she was afraid. But because she was watching him drown in his own mistake. Because she already knew what was about to happen. Greg dragged her toward the door, his fingers tight around her arm, his grip firm, like she was some trespasser caught in the act, like she was nothing more than an intruder in a space that he believed she could never rightfully claim. And then, as if to drive the final nail into the coffin of his own downfall, he muttered the words that would come back to haunt him. You people think you can just walk in anywhere and, the courtroom doors flew open. The sharp sound of wood hitting marble echoed through the chamber, ringing in Greg's ears like a warning bell he hadn't been prepared for. A voice, shocked and furious, sliced through the tension. What the hell is going on in here? The court clerk stood in the doorway, her face drained of color, her eyes darting between the officer and the woman he was dragging. Greg felt a strange, unfamiliar unease curl in his stomach. Something was wrong. The woman, the one he had mishandled without a thought, the one he had been so certain was nobody, slowly reached into the pocket of her blazer. Greg froze. Every nerve in his body went on high alert. His grip tightened. Don't even think about it, he snapped, his voice dropping into the low, deadly tone that had once commanded fear. She didn't flinch. Her fingers wrapped around something metallic. Something small, yet heavy with significance. And then, with the calm certainty of someone who had all the power in the world, she placed it in front of his face. A judge's badge. Greg's breath stopped. His brain stalled. His chest tightened. The name on the badge, the one engraved in silver, the one that belonged to the presiding judge of this very courtroom, matched the name outside the door. The name of the woman he had just put his hands on. Aaliyah Carter. Judge Aaliyah Carter. And in that single moment, in that single breath, Greg Millstone realized one thing. He had just destroyed his entire life. The silence in the courtroom was suffocating, thick with tension that wrapped itself around every person in the room like a vice. The weight of what had just happened still hung in the air, suffused with disbelief, anger, and the slow-burning horror of an irreversible mistake. Judge Aaliyah Carter remained still, her posture poised, her eyes locked onto Greg Millstone with a gaze that was unreadable, yet devastatingly clear. The badge she had presented was no longer in her hand but now rested on the desk, shining under the artificial light, a silent testament to her authority. The authority he had not only disregarded, but violently dismissed. Greg's breathing was unsteady, his heart pounding so hard he thought his ribs might crack under the pressure. His fingers twitched at his sides, itching to find something to hold on to, something to steady himself, but there was nothing. No gun, no badge, no defense. The reality of the situation had hit him like a freight train, and yet, a part of him refused to fully absorb it. His entire life had been built on the foundation that he was the one in control, that he was the one who dictated order. But now, standing in front of her, realizing what he had done, he felt something foreign clawing at his chest. Fear. The court clerk was still frozen in place, her hand over her mouth, eyes wide and darting between the judge and the officer. The only sound in the room was the distant murmur of voices from outside the heavy wooden doors, oblivious to the chaos unraveling within. Greg swallowed hard, his throat dry as sandpaper. His mind raced for a way out, a way to fix this, but there was no escaping what had just happened. His voice came out, hoarse and barely above a whisper. "Your Honor." Aaliyah raised a hand, silencing him instantly. The way she moved, slow, deliberate, was enough to make his stomach twist into knots. "You put your hands on me," she said, the words spoken not in anger, but in finality. Greg's pulse roared in his ears. I didn't realize, you thought I was trespassing. You thought I was an intruder in my own courtroom. You assumed," she interrupted, her voice razor-sharp yet eerily controlled. "Without hesitation, without verification, you grabbed me. You dragged me across my own courtroom like I was some criminal. Tell me, Officer Millstone," she leaned forward slightly, her eyes dark and piercing, "did it ever even cross your mind that I could be exactly where I was supposed to be?" His mouth opened, but no words came. His brain screamed at him to fix it, to make this situation disappear, but there was no fixing this. He had spent years demanding compliance, enforcing authority, making sure others followed the rules he upheld. And yet, when it came to his own actions, he had violated all of them. The door opened again. This time, it was Court Administrator Richard Daniels, a tall, stocky man in his 60s who had served under 3 different judges in his time. His eyes scanned the room, and in an instant, he understood that something had gone terribly wrong. His gaze locked onto Greg before shifting to Aaliyah, his voice careful but firm. "Judge Carter, is everything all right?" Aaliyah straightened, finally breaking eye contact with Greg, as if he had become insignificant. She turned her attention to the administrator, her voice perfectly level. "No, Richard. It is not," she said, then gestured toward Greg. "This officer just physically removed me from my own courtroom." The administrator's entire body stiffened. His face darkened, but he remained professional, shifting his focus to Greg, whose body was rigid as a statue. "Officer Millstone, is that true?" Greg felt a deep, burning shame crawl up his throat, but his pride, that stubborn part of him that had always refused to back down, fought against it. He wanted to defend himself, to claim misunderstanding, to insist that he was just doing his job, but no excuse could erase what had happened. And worst of all, he knew it. I made an error," he forced out, his voice unsteady. Richard's jaw clenched. "An error," Aaliyah repeated, almost as if tasting the word, letting it roll over her tongue like something bitter. "Is that what you call physically assaulting a sitting judge?" Greg flinched at the word. His entire career had been spent using language to protect himself and his colleagues. Physical intervention, necessary force, lawful detainment. But there was no spinning this into something palatable. He had put his hands on a judge. And there were witnesses. Richard exhaled sharply, rubbing his temple as if trying to decide what the next move was. The tension in the room had become unbearable, the air thick with the weight of impending consequences. Before he could speak, the doors opened again. This time, it was Captain James Holloway, Greg's superior. His uniform was crisp, his presence commanding, and the moment his gaze landed on the scene before him, Greg felt the weight in his chest triple. Holloway's expression didn't shift, but there was something in his eyes, something calculating. He took one look at Greg's stiff posture, at Aaliyah Carter's unreadable expression, at the silent badge still gleaming on the desk, and Greg knew, he already knew everything. "Judge Carter," Holloway addressed her directly, his voice controlled. "I was informed of a situation regarding one of my officers. I take it there was an incident?" Aaliyah didn't answer right away. She let the silence stretch, let it sink in, let it burn into Greg's skin. Then, finally, she picked up her badge, turning it in her hands slowly, almost absent-mindedly. When she spoke, her voice was measured, but Greg could feel the power behind it. "Captain Holloway," she said, her tone smooth as glass, "your officer assaulted me in my own courtroom." Greg felt the room shift. Holloway's jaw tightened, his fingers flexing slightly at his sides, the only indication that this was bad, worse than bad. The captain knew what this meant. Everyone in the room did. Greg wanted to speak. He wanted to explain. He wanted to say something, anything that could soften the impact of what had just been declared. But the words wouldn't come. Aaliyah let the silence hang, just long enough for everyone to feel the gravity of what had been said. Then, she placed her badge back down on the desk with a quiet click, folded her hands neatly in front of her, and met the captain's eyes. "I trust," she said, her voice dripping with quiet authority, "that you know exactly what needs to happen next." The words sent ice through Greg's veins. His world, the foundation he had built everything on, was now crumbling beneath his feet. And he had nowhere to run. The air in the courthouse had changed. It wasn't just thick with tension anymore, it was electric, charged with something deeper, something irreversible. The moment had stretched beyond mere confrontation, it had settled into something much more dangerous. A reckoning. Judge Aaliyah Carter sat behind her desk, composed yet unreadable, her fingers resting lightly on the surface of the polished wood, her expression revealing nothing. Across from her, Greg Millstone stood rigid, his body locked in place, as if moving would only make things worse. His superior, Captain James Holloway, had barely spoken since arriving, but the weight of his presence was suffocating. His silence was louder than any reprimand, his stillness more damning than a shouted accusation. Aaliyah's eyes never left Greg. They held him there, pinned like an insect under glass. "Sit down," she said finally, her voice soft, but carrying an authority that left no room for refusal. Greg hesitated for half a second too long. "That wasn't a request," she added. His legs moved before he fully processed the command. The chair beneath him felt cold, unfamiliar, as though he were the one standing trial. His fingers flexed against his thighs, every instinct screaming at him to fix this, to speak, to justify, but there was nothing he could say. Aaliyah exhaled through her nose, leaning back slightly in her chair. She didn't rush. Didn't hurry. This was her moment, and she let the silence stretch, let him feel it press down on him. "You've been a police officer for how many years, Officer Millstone?" Greg swallowed, his throat dry. 19. 19 years, she repeated, rolling the words over her tongue as if testing their weight. "And in those 19 years, how many times have you acted before thinking?" His pulse pounded in his ears. "Your Honor, I answer the question." He gritted his teeth. "I don't know." Aaliyah tilted her head slightly. "You don't know," she echoed, her voice void of any real emotion. "How many times have you assumed someone wasn't supposed to be somewhere?" Greg clenched his jaw so tight he thought it might snap. "I've made decisions based on what I thought was best in the moment." "What you thought," she mused, almost to herself. She tapped her nails lightly against the desk. Tell me, Officer Millstone, when was the last time you questioned whether your instinct was wrong? A sharp pain pressed against his temple. His shoulders felt like they carried the weight of every mistake he had ever made, but this one was the worst. He had never been questioned like this. Never been held accountable like this. Captain Holloway finally spoke. His voice was calm, measured, but heavy. Judge Carter, he said, choosing his words carefully, I can assure you, this situation will be addressed accordingly. Aaliyah didn't blink. What does that mean, Captain? Holloway hesitated. Because I know what it means when people like me hear the word addressed, she continued, her voice deceptively smooth. It means paperwork. It means closed-door conversations. It means another officer walks away with a slap on the wrist. Holloway exhaled, tension evident in the way his fingers curled slightly at his sides. That's not how I run my department. Aaliyah nodded slowly, considering. And yet, Officer Millstone is still sitting in my courtroom, wearing his badge. Greg's chest tightened. A part of him wanted to argue. To fight. To defend himself, but how? The truth was right in front of him. He had no excuses. You know, Aaliyah continued, I've sat in this chair for years now. I've presided over cases where officers have stood where you are standing, Captain. Officers who swore they made the right call. Who swore it wasn't about race. Who swore it was just a mistake. And do you know what I've noticed? She leaned forward, her eyes locking onto Greg's. They always walk in here so certain. So convinced that their instinct was unshakable. That they couldn't be wrong. And when the weight of their actions finally catches up to them, when they finally have to face what they've done, it's not regret I see in their eyes. The room was still. It's fear. Greg's breathing was uneven now, his shoulders stiff. His fear had caught up to him. You're afraid, she said, her voice quiet. Not of what you did. But of what's coming next. He hated how accurate she was. Aaliyah's fingers tapped against the desk again, her movements slow, deliberate. Then, she reached for a folder, sliding it across the desk toward Captain Holloway. Inside that file, she said, is a formal complaint. Not just for assaulting a sitting judge, but for the excessive force complaints attached to Officer Millstone's record. I requested them earlier today. Greg's stomach dropped. His head snapped toward the captain, but Holloway didn't meet his gaze. You see, Aaliyah continued, her voice deceptively light, this wasn't just one mistake, was it, officer? Greg's hands clenched into fists. Aaliyah didn't let him finish. I could take this case straight to the district attorney. I could take it to the press. I could make sure that everyone in this city knows exactly who you are, exactly what you've done. The room felt smaller, the walls closer. Holloway's voice was low. What do you want, Judge Carter? Aaliyah smiled. It wasn't kind. It wasn't warm. It was just. I want him off the force. Greg stopped breathing. His heart slammed against his ribs. Holloway remained unreadable. Judge Carter, you have two choices, she said, voice like steel. Either you terminate Officer Millstone's employment today, or I bury him in this courtroom. Greg's world collapsed. Holloway nodded once. It'll be done. Greg's stomach twisted into something unrecognizable. His hands shook. His chest felt hollow. Aaliyah stood, gathering her papers. She glanced at Greg one last time, no mercy in her gaze. You're dismissed. Greg's legs felt heavy as he stood, his body numb. He had walked into this courtroom believing he was the one with authority. But now, as he turned toward the door, as his entire career crumbled around him, he finally understood. He had never been the one with power. And now, he had nothing left. Greg's legs felt like dead weight beneath him. The moment he turned toward the door, the reality of it all came crashing down, heavier than anything he had ever carried. His badge, the very thing that had given him purpose, authority, control, was about to be taken from him. His entire identity, shattered in a matter of minutes. He could hear the blood pounding in his ears, his vision narrowing as if the walls of the courtroom were closing in around him. The humiliation was suffocating, but worse than that was the finality of it. There was no undoing this. No talking his way out. No walking away unscathed. Captain Holloway had barely moved, but Greg could feel the weight of his gaze, the silent confirmation that everything Aaliyah had said was already decided. His future was no longer in his hands. It was in hers. And she had just condemned him. Aaliyah Carter watched him with that same unreadable expression, one that Greg now understood wasn't cold, it was deliberate. Every second she let him stew in silence was intentional. She wanted him to feel this. To sit in it. To understand, in a way he never had before, what it meant to have everything stripped away by someone with the power to decide his fate. His throat was dry when he finally spoke, voice hoarse, barely above a whisper. "This is my life. You're taking away everything I've built." Aaliyah didn't blink. "No, Officer Millstone. I'm holding you accountable." Greg's fingers curled into fists at his sides. "For one mistake." Aaliyah's brow lifted just slightly, as if she was almost amused by his audacity. "One mistake." She gestured toward the file Holloway still held in his grip. "That file says otherwise. That file tells me this is a pattern, not a mistake. How many complaints have been buried, officer? How many people have you treated the way you treated me today? And how many of them didn't have the power to fight back?" Greg's mouth opened, but the words wouldn't come. Because he knew. He knew that if this had been anyone else, someone without authority, without a title, this would have already been forgotten. A routine incident. A moment of instinct that no one would question. But this time, he had grabbed the wrong person. "I swore to protect and serve," Greg said finally, voice tight, desperate to make her understand. "I've given this job everything. I've put my life on the line for this city, for people like you." Aaliyah's expression didn't shift, but something in her gaze sharpened, something dangerous and unforgiving. "People like me?" Greg froze. His stomach plummeted as he realized what he had just said. The words had come out too easily, too naturally. A slip, but not really. Because this was how he thought. Aaliyah let the silence stretch, her eyes never leaving his, never giving him an inch of reprieve. And then, finally, she spoke, her voice soft but lethal. "Do you think I need you to protect me?" Greg swallowed hard. "You think the people who look like me need your protection?" she continued, her tone almost too calm. "Because I've seen what that protection looks like, Officer Millstone. I've seen how it manifests. I've seen how it destroys lives." Greg's pulse roared in his ears, his skin hot with shame. He couldn't move. He couldn't look away. "You think your service absolves you?" Aaliyah asked, tilting her head slightly. "Do you think the badge you wear makes you untouchable? That the years you've put into this job somehow erase the harm you've done?" Greg inhaled sharply, his chest rising and falling too fast. "You didn't mean," Aaliyah interrupted, her voice razor sharp. "Just like you didn't mean to assume I wasn't supposed to be in my own courtroom. Just like you didn't mean to grab me. Just like you didn't mean to humiliate me." Greg clenched his teeth so hard his jaw ached. "I made a mistake." Aaliyah leaned forward slightly, her eyes never breaking from his. "You think I don't know what it's like to make a mistake? You think I haven't sat in this very chair and agonized over my decisions, knowing that one ruling could alter the course of someone's entire life? The difference, Officer Millstone, is that I am held accountable. Every single day." Greg's breath came out in uneven bursts. His entire body felt like it was unraveling, the weight of her words pressing down on him until he could barely breathe. Aaliyah exhaled, slow, deliberate. But you make a mistake, and the system protects you. Your department protects you. Society protects you. Until today. The finality of her words sent a deep, gut-wrenching dread through Greg's spine. This was it. This was the moment where his life divided into before and after. Captain Holloway stepped forward then, his voice flat, emotionless. Hand over your badge. Greg's heart stopped. His breath hitched. His fingers twitched at his sides. His body refused to move. Now, officer, Holloway added, his tone leaving no room for argument. Greg swallowed the lump in his throat. His hand reached for the badge pinned to his chest, the badge he had worn every day for 19 years. He hesitated. His fingers curled around the metal. The weight of it suddenly felt unbearable. And then, with no other choice, he unpinned it. The moment the badge left his uniform, it felt like his entire existence shattered. He placed it on the desk in front of him. The sound of it hitting the wood echoed in the courtroom. Final. Permanent. Holloway's gaze didn't waver. Your gun. Greg's stomach twisted violently. He felt like he was dissolving, piece by piece. Slowly, mechanically, he reached for his holster, unbuckling it. He placed the firearm beside the badge. There it was. Everything. Everything he was, reduced to two objects on a desk. Aaliyah's eyes flickered to them before returning to Greg. She studied him for a long moment, then exhaled, pushing back from her desk. When she spoke again, her voice was calm. You wanted to take me out of this courtroom today, she said, her tone almost thoughtful. But look at how this turned out. You're the one walking out, not me. Greg's throat burned. His vision blurred. His pride, his identity, everything he thought he knew about himself, it was all gone. Holloway turned toward the door. Come on, Millstone. Let's go. Greg didn't move. Not right away. He sat there, staring at the badge and gun in front of him, staring at the evidence of his fall. Then, finally, with no other choice, he stood. He turned, walking toward the door with steps that felt heavier than they ever had before. As he reached the threshold, Aaliyah's voice rang out behind him. Officer Millstone. He stopped. She let the silence hang for just a moment longer, making sure it settled deep, making sure he felt it. Then, she spoke. I hope you think about this moment every single day for the rest of your life. Greg closed his eyes. Then, without another word, he walked out of the courtroom. And the door closed behind him. The weight of the door closing behind Greg Millstone was deafening. He had walked out of that courtroom, but it didn't feel like he had left. The echoes of everything that had happened still clung to him like a second skin, suffocating, inescapable. He had spent years believing he was the one in control, the one making the decisions, dictating the course of events for those he encountered. But today, that illusion had been stripped away, torn from his grasp, leaving him with nothing but the raw, undeniable truth. He was powerless now. His footsteps down the courthouse hallway felt foreign, unfamiliar, like the rhythm of a man who no longer belonged in the world he once commanded. He could feel eyes on him, could hear whispers ripple through the corridor as people turned to look. Some had already heard. Some didn't know but could sense that something monumental had occurred. His uniform, once a symbol of authority, now felt like a costume, a hollow representation of a role he no longer played. Captain Holloway walked beside him, his stride steady, unwavering. Greg could barely bring himself to look at him, the reality of his downfall too present, too overwhelming. He could see the exit ahead, the courthouse doors that led out to the steps, out to a world that no longer respected him, no longer feared him, no longer even acknowledged him as one of them. They stepped outside. The heat pressed against his skin, but it wasn't the sun, it was the stairs. People had gathered. Reporters. Officers. Civilians. A few court employees stood in small clusters, murmuring amongst themselves. A camera flash went off. The shame surged through him like fire. Holloway's voice was quiet but firm. "Get in the car, Greg." Greg hesitated. There was a part of him that wanted to stay, to argue, to fight for himself, but what was left to say? What could he possibly say that wouldn't make this worse? His hands clenched at his sides before he finally moved, stepping off the courthouse steps and toward the waiting patrol car. It was ironic. He had spent years watching others take this walk, ushering them into the back of police vehicles, ensuring they understood that they were no longer in control. Now, it was his turn to feel the weight of that humiliation. The car door shut behind him. Holloway didn't say anything as he slid into the driver's seat, pulling the vehicle away from the courthouse and into the city streets. The silence between them was thick, stretched taut like a wire on the verge of snapping. Greg could feel the anger simmering beneath his skin, not at Aaliyah Carter, not at Holloway, but at himself. For years, he had believed in the system, believed that it was structured in a way that protected those who upheld it, those who enforced it. But now he realized that belief had been a luxury, a privilege that only existed until it didn't. He had thought himself untouchable. That assumption had cost him everything. Holloway finally spoke. "You know this isn't going away, right?" Greg exhaled sharply, his hands gripping his knees. "I figured." "You think she was bluffing?" Holloway's tone was unreadable. Greg scoffed, shaking his head. "Not for a second." There was a pause. "You fucked up," Holloway said plainly. "Big time." Greg let out a bitter laugh, though there was no humor in it. "Yeah. I got that part." Holloway sighed, gripping the wheel tighter. "You've got two choices, Millstone. You can go down fighting, drag this into an appeal, make a show of it, try to convince yourself that the system you believed in is suddenly going to protect you the way it protected you before. Or, you take this loss, walk away with what little dignity you have left, and figure out what comes next." Greg stared out the window. The streets blurred past, the city moving forward while he sat there, unmoving, stuck in a life that no longer fit him. The uniform, the badge, the job, it had all defined him for so long. Without it, who the hell was he? "You think I got a shot at an appeal?" he muttered, though he already knew the answer. Holloway exhaled through his nose, shaking his head. "Not with that record. And not with Carter sitting on the other end of it." The thought of it made Greg's chest tighten. Aaliyah Carter wasn't just another judge, she was the judge he had laid hands on. There was no version of this where he walked away unscathed. "She's not going to let me come back from this," Greg said, voice hollow. Holloway glanced at him briefly before turning back to the road. "Would you?" Greg didn't answer. The car rolled to a stop in front of his house. Greg barely recognized it. It felt smaller somehow, unfamiliar, as if the home itself had distanced itself from him, ashamed to be associated with him. He didn't move to get out. His hands stayed clenched, his body rigid. "You should talk to someone," Holloway said after a moment. "Get ahead of it. Control the story before it controls you." Greg laughed again, short and bitter. "Control? That's funny." Holloway didn't argue. He didn't need to. Greg knew exactly what he meant. The news would spread. The department would distance itself. His career was over, but his name didn't have to be. He had seen it happen before, officers caught in scandal, some sinking, some reinventing themselves before the world could fully turn against them. But Greg knew the truth. There was no reinvention for him. There was no coming back. He opened the door, stepping out onto the pavement, the weight of everything pressing down on him so hard his knees almost buckled. Holloway didn't say goodbye. He didn't offer words of comfort or a promise of better days ahead. He just waited until Greg shut the door behind him, then drove away. Greg stood there for a long moment, staring at the front of his house, at the place that was supposed to be his sanctuary, but now just felt like another place he didn't belong. His hands twitched. His chest ached. He walked up the steps and into his home, the quiet inside even more deafening than the silence in the courthouse. He was alone now. For the first time in his life, he truly understood what it meant to be on the other side of power. And he hated it. Greg sat in his living room, sinking deeper into the worn cushions of the couch, staring at nothing in particular. His body felt impossibly heavy, as if all the weight of his 19-year career, his decisions, his mistakes, and the unraveling of his entire identity had settled onto his chest, pressing him down, making it difficult to breathe. The walls of the house that had once been his sanctuary now felt like they were closing in, suffocating, trapping him in a reality he couldn't escape. His mind raced in circles, replaying every second of the courtroom, the judge's stare, the moment he was told to remove his badge, the sound of it hitting the wooden desk, the finality of it all. He had been so sure of himself, so certain of his place in the world, of his authority, of his rightness, until suddenly, he wasn't. Now, the house was unbearably quiet, filled only with the distant hum of the refrigerator, the occasional creak of the floorboard settling, and the sound of his own shallow breathing. Then, the sharp sound of a key turning in the lock made his heart jump to his throat. The front door opened, and his wife, Dana, stepped inside. He didn't have to look at her to know she already knew. Of course, she knew. News traveled fast, but something like this? Something like the public humiliation of Officer Greg Millstone being stripped of his badge, escorted out of the courthouse under the watchful eyes of reporters, officers, and civilians alike, it didn't just travel fast. It spread like wildfire. He could feel the tension radiating off her before she even spoke, before she even put down her purse. When she finally did, it wasn't a gentle motion. It was deliberate, a controlled force that told him she was holding something back, holding a lot back. She crossed her arms, standing in the middle of the room like she was preparing for a battle she never thought she would have to fight. Do you want to tell me what happened, or should I hear it from the rest of the city? Greg exhaled slowly, running a hand over his face, feeling the scratch of stubble that had already started to form, his mind scrambling for the right words, but coming up with nothing. Where could he even start? How did he even explain this? He had spent years being the one with answers, the one in control, the one with authority, and now, for the first time in his life, he was at a complete loss. Dana didn't move closer. She didn't offer him comfort, didn't soften the edge in her voice. Then let me start for you. I got calls today, Greg. Calls. People asking me if I knew that my husband, the great Officer Millstone, was being removed from the force. Do you have any idea how humiliating that is? Greg clenched his jaw, his fingers twitching slightly. You think I don't know that? You think I don't know what this means for me? For us? Dana let out a short, bitter laugh, shaking her head. For you. That's what you're worried about. For you. You don't get it, do you? This isn't just about you losing your job. This is about who you are. Who I married. Who you've always been. I stood by you for 19 years, Greg. I defended you when people called you too aggressive, too harsh, when they said you were the kind of cop who didn't know when to back down, who didn't know when to think before acting. I told them, no, not my husband. My husband is a good man. He's a good officer. Greg felt something inside of him tighten, something that felt dangerously close to breaking. I am a good man. Dana's expression didn't change. She didn't blink, didn't soften, didn't give him an inch. Are you? His throat felt dry, his hands clenched into fists on his lap. You really think I did this on purpose? Dana cut him off before he could finish, stepping forward slightly, her voice sharper now. I think you walked into that courtroom and saw a black woman sitting in power, and your first instinct was that she didn't belong there. Your first instinct was to remove her. And you didn't even stop to question it. Greg felt something snap in his chest. His pulse was roaring in his ears. That's not what happened. Dana crossed her arms tighter. Then what happened, Greg? Tell me. Make me understand, because all I see is exactly what the rest of the city sees, a cop who put his hands on a judge because he assumed she didn't belong. Greg pushed himself up from the couch, the anger bubbling under his skin now, sharp and defensive. It wasn't about that. Dana's eyes narrowed. No. Then what was it about? Tell me. Explain to me why you saw a woman behind that bench and thought your job was to drag her out of her own courtroom. Greg opened his mouth. Nothing came out. The words weren't there. The excuse wasn't there. Because deep down, he knew. He knew that if she had been anyone else, if she had looked any different, if she had fit the image he was used to seeing, he never would have touched her. Dana watched the realization settle on his face. You don't even have an answer, do you? Greg turned away, his jaw clenched so tight it ached. He hated this. Hated the way she was looking at him. Hated the way she was making him feel. Like she was seeing him for the first time. Like he was someone else. Her voice softened just slightly, but it didn't lose its weight. Do you have any idea what this means for our family? For Ethan? You think kids at school won't hear about this? You think he won't have to answer for what his father did? Greg's stomach twisted violently. His son. Ethan. 15 years old. He had always been proud that his father was an officer. Had always defended him when other kids talked badly about the police, had held his head high because his father was a man of the law, a man who protected people. What would Ethan think now? Dana shook her head, looking at him like she was searching for something, some remnant of the man she had married, some proof that he was still in there somewhere. You walk around this house acting like you've been wronged, like you're the victim here. But Greg, you did this. You. And for the first time in your life, you don't get to walk away from it. Greg felt like he was drowning. His chest was tight, his hands shaking at his sides. His voice came out low, raw. So what? You're gonna leave. Dana didn't answer right away. She let the question sit there, let it settle in the air between them. When she finally spoke, her voice was quiet, but firm. I don't know. Greg's breath caught. She grabbed her purse, turning toward the door. I'm taking Ethan to my sister's for a few days. I need time to think. And I think you do too. Greg wanted to stop her. Wanted to reach for her, to fix this. But what was there to say? She looked back one last time, her gaze unwavering. You have to live with this, Greg. And I really hope, for your sake, that you figure out how. Then she was gone. And for the first time, Greg Millstone was truly alone. Greg sat in the silence of his empty house, the weight of it pressing down on him in a way he had never felt before. The echoes of Dana's words still rang in his ears, cutting deeper than he wanted to admit. He had spent his entire life believing in control, in order, in the structure of the world as he understood it. But now, everything had collapsed around him, and there was nothing left to hold on to. His badge was gone. His gun was gone. His career was gone. And now, his wife and son had walked out the door, leaving him alone with nothing but the wreckage of his own making. His hands shook as he ran them over his face, exhaling heavily. He didn't know how long he had been sitting there, staring at the same spot on the floor, lost in the storm of his thoughts. His body felt like a shell, hollow and disconnected from reality. The past few days had unraveled him piece by piece, stripping him down to something unrecognizable. He had spent years walking with his chest out, his head high, knowing exactly who he was, what he stood for. Now, he wasn't sure of anything. A sudden knock at the door made him jolt. His heart kicked up, a reflex that hadn't faded, even now. He hesitated before standing, dragging his feet toward the door like a man walking to his own execution. He wasn't sure who he expected to see when he opened it, but Judge Aaliyah Carter standing on his front porch was the last thing he could have imagined. He froze, gripping the edge of the door as he stared at her. She was dressed in a simple blazer and slacks, her expression unreadable, her gaze steady. She looked as composed as she had in the courtroom, as if she had come here knowing exactly what she wanted to say, exactly how this moment would play out. Greg's throat tightened, his mind racing. "You gonna let me in?" Aaliyah's voice was calm, but there was an edge to it, something that told him she wasn't here to make this easy. Greg hesitated for a second too long before stepping back and opening the door wider. She walked inside without another word, her heels clicking against the hardwood floors, her presence commanding the space as if she belonged there. He closed the door behind her, his palms sweaty, his chest tight. She turned to face him, crossing her arms. "You look like hell." Greg let out a short, humorless laugh, shaking his head. "Yeah, well. It's been a rough few days." Aaliyah didn't smile. Didn't offer even the smallest hint of sympathy. "Good." Greg flinched. He shouldn't have been surprised, but hearing it, feeling it, hit harder than he expected. "You know why I'm here?" she asked, tilting her head slightly. Greg swallowed, nodding. "To make sure I know just how bad I screwed up." Aaliyah's eyes narrowed. "You really think I came all the way here just to rub salt in the wound?" Greg didn't answer. He honestly didn't know. He wasn't sure of anything anymore. Aaliyah sighed, looking around the house as if taking it all in, the silence, the emptiness. "You're sitting in this house feeling sorry for yourself, aren't you? Feeling like the world turned against you, like I turned against you. Like everything was fine until suddenly, it wasn't." Greg exhaled sharply, running a hand through his hair. "You don't understand," Aaliyah cut him off before he could finish. "No, you don't understand. You spent 19 years making decisions that affected people's lives, using your instincts to decide who belonged where, who needed to be removed, who needed to be controlled. And you never once questioned whether you were wrong. Not until now. And even now, you're still struggling to see it." Greg clenched his jaw, his chest tightening. "I've questioned myself plenty of times." Aaliyah scoffed. "No, you haven't. You've questioned outcomes, maybe. Questioned whether you did enough, whether you could have pushed harder, gone further. But have you ever questioned whether you should have acted at all?" Greg stared at her, his hands gripping the back of the chair in front of him, holding on as if it were the only thing keeping him upright. His breath came out unsteady. "I thought I was doing the right thing." Aaliyah nodded slowly, her eyes scanning his face. "That's the problem." Greg's grip tightened. "What do you want from me?" His voice was quieter now, less defensive, more lost. Aaliyah studied him for a long moment before answering. "I want you to understand what you did. I want you to sit with it. Not just losing your job. Not just losing your badge. But the real weight of it. Because this isn't just about you. It's about every person you've ever treated the way you treated me." Greg swallowed hard. His mouth was dry. His entire body felt like it was trembling, but he forced himself to stay still. "And then what?" Aaliyah tilted her head slightly, her gaze piercing. "That's up to you." Greg felt something shift inside him. It wasn't relief. It wasn't clarity. It was something else, something he wasn't sure he even had the words for. Aaliyah stepped toward the door, pausing before opening it. She glanced at him over her shoulder, her voice softer but still firm. "You're not the first man to believe his power made him untouchable. And you won't be the last. But what you do now. That's what defines you." Greg stood there as she walked out, the door closing behind her with a quiet click. And for the first time, he realized that the real punishment wasn't losing his badge. It was finally seeing himself for what he truly was. Greg sat at the small table in the corner of the diner, staring at the black coffee in front of him. It had gone cold a while ago, untouched, but he wasn't here for the coffee. He had been coming to this place for weeks now, ever since Dana and Ethan left, ever since his life as he knew it crumbled. It wasn't much, just a quiet place where he could sit without feeling like the whole world was watching him, whispering about him, waiting to see what would happen next. He had spent years walking into restaurants, grocery stores, and gas stations with a sense of authority, a presence that commanded respect, or at the very least, caution. Now, he was just another nobody sitting alone in the corner. His phone buzzed on the table, but he ignored it. The calls had slowed down in the past few days, mostly because people had already moved on to the next scandal, the next big controversy. He wasn't news anymore. He was just another name in the long list of men who had fallen from grace, another cautionary tale. Then the door opened, and Greg looked up. Ethan. Greg's stomach twisted as his son stepped inside, scanning the diner until their eyes met. He looked different. Or maybe Greg was just seeing him clearly for the first time. He wasn't a little boy anymore. He was a teenager with his own thoughts, his own sense of right and wrong, his own view of the world, and for the first time, Greg wasn't sure if he was part of that world anymore. Ethan walked over slowly, sliding into the seat across from him. Greg searched his face for something, anger, disappointment, maybe even resentment, but he saw none of it. Just a quiet sort of sadness, a distance that hadn't been there before. Greg cleared his throat, unsure where to start. "I didn't think you'd come." Ethan shrugged, looking down at his hands. "Mom said I should." Greg exhaled through his nose. "She's still mad?" Ethan hesitated before nodding. "Yeah. But I think she's just tired." Greg nodded slowly. He couldn't blame her. He was tired too. They sat in silence for a long moment before Ethan spoke again, his voice careful, measured. "Did you ever think about how it felt? For the people you arrested? The ones who didn't do anything wrong?" Greg's stomach turned. His instinct was to argue, to defend himself, but that instinct didn't belong to him anymore. He forced himself to be honest. "No," he admitted. "Not until now." Ethan studied him, his expression unreadable. "And now?" Greg let out a slow breath, running a hand through his hair. "Now, I think about it all the time." Ethan nodded, as if that was the only answer he had expected. He looked down at the table, tracing the grain of the wood with his fingertips. "I used to tell people you were a hero." Greg's chest ached. "And now?" Ethan lifted his eyes, meeting his father's gaze head-on. "Now, I just want to know if you're going to be better." Greg swallowed hard. The question sat between them like a challenge, like a lifeline. He had spent his life defining himself by his uniform, his badge, his authority. But without it, who was he? Who did he want to be? "I don't know," Greg admitted, his voice quieter than he intended. "But I want to figure it out." Ethan considered that for a moment before nodding. "Good." The waitress came by, refilling Greg's coffee. He barely noticed. He was still staring at his son, at the only thing left in his life that mattered. In the weeks that followed, Greg took the first steps toward rebuilding what he had lost. Not his job, not his reputation, himself. He started reading, listening, trying to understand things he had never cared to understand before. He started volunteering at a community center, talking to people he would have dismissed in his past life. He didn't do it to earn forgiveness or to clear his name. He did it because he needed to change. Because Ethan was watching. Because for the first time, Greg Millstone wanted to be the man his son could be proud of. Dana didn't come home right away. She needed time, and Greg respected that. But eventually, they met for coffee. She saw the change in his face, in his posture, in the way he listened instead of waiting to speak. They didn't fix everything overnight, but the door wasn't completely closed anymore. And Aaliyah Carter? She continued sitting on her bench, presiding over cases, demanding accountability, making sure men like Greg were held responsible for their actions. But she never spoke his name again. He wasn't worth it. And maybe that was the greatest punishment of all. Now, let me ask you something. What does it take for someone to truly change? Is it losing everything? Is it seeing yourself for what you really are? Or is it something deeper, the realization that you were never the person you thought you were in the first place? Drop a comment below and tell me what you think. Can someone like Greg Millstone ever really redeem himself? Or is his downfall exactly what he deserved? And if you liked this story, make sure to subscribe to Tales of Twist for more powerful stories just like this. Hit that like button, share your thoughts, and I'll see you in the next one.